The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, too tight, too aggressive. The police officer smirked as he yanked her forward, his grip rough, unnecessary. People in the boutique stared, some whispered, some avoided eye contact, others pulled out their phones, recording. But no one stepped in. No one spoke up. The humiliation was suffocating, burning in her chest like fire. She had done nothing wrong. Not a single thing. And yet, here she was, being dragged out of an upscale boutique in broad daylight, handcuffed, treated like a criminal. You people always think you can get away with it, the officer sneered, shoving her forward. You people. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with rage bubbling just beneath the surface. You know what I mean, he said, tightening his grip as he pulled her outside. Ain't no way you were gonna pay for that bag. We got a call. Said you were acting suspicious. Suspicious. That word hung in the air like poison. Suspicious because she had the audacity to exist in this space. Because she dared to browse a store that people like them didn't think she belonged in. Because the sight of a confident black woman in designer heels made people uncomfortable. She twisted her wrists in the cuffs, trying to find relief from the pressure, but it was useless. The humiliation sank deeper. She could feel the weight of every stare, every hushed voice that passed judgment without knowing the truth. Check the cameras, she said through clenched teeth. I didn't steal anything. The second officer, one with a beer belly pressing against his belt, chuckled. Cameras don't tell the whole story, sweetheart. And we got a witness. A witness? Her breath hitched. She turned toward the boutique, toward the store manager standing smugly in the doorway, arms crossed. I saw her slipping something into her bag, the manager said, voice sickly sweet, full of fake innocence. Her stomach twisted. A blatant lie. A calculated, intentional lie. You lied, she said, her voice shaking. You know damn well I didn't take anything. The manager shrugged. We take theft very seriously here. A hot wave of helpless fury crashed over her. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but stand there and take this. But what could she do? The system wasn't built to listen to people like her. They wanted her in these cuffs. They wanted her humiliated. One of the officers leaned in close, his voice a low whisper only she could hear. Best thing you can do, he said, lips curling into a grin, is keep that pretty mouth shut. No one's coming to save you. A slow smile crept onto her face. A smile that made the officer's grin falter, just a little. She lifted her chin, staring him dead in the eye. You sure about that? And then, she made the call. She could still feel the weight of their hands on her, the heat of their arrogance, but now there was something else. A shift. A ripple in the air. The moment she dialed the number, the moment the call connected, everything changed. A deep voice answered on the other end, steady and controlled. They arrested me, she said, voice calm despite the fury raging inside her. For nothing. I need you to handle it. There was silence. A dangerous, heavy silence. Then, just 2 words. I'm on my way. The officers laughed, entertained by her apparent desperation. Who'd you call? One of them mocked. Your boyfriend? Your lawyer? But she didn't answer. She just stared at them. Watched them. Memorized every detail of their smug faces. Because in just a few minutes, everything they thought they knew, about power, about privilege, about her, was about to be shattered. And they wouldn't even see it coming. At Plough of Twist, we stand against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This story highlights the harsh reality that too many black people face, but it also delivers a powerful message of justice, resilience, and strength. If you've ever felt unheard or mistreated because of the color of your skin, know that you are valued, you are powerful, and you are not alone. Now, sit back and enjoy this emotional, dramatic, and impactful story. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Let's keep spreading awareness and powerful narratives together. Now, let's begin. The city pulsed with life, a symphony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and distant conversations blending into a chaotic harmony. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the streets, reflecting off the sleek glass windows of towering buildings. The air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe, mingling with the subtle undertone of city grit. It was a place of movement, of ambition, where dreams were built and broken within the span of a single moment. And for Simone Carter, this city was both her battleground and her home. She had fought for every inch of success she had earned. Raised in the heart of Atlanta, she had grown up watching her mother work endless shifts as a nurse, her father juggling 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. Nothing had ever come easy, and that lesson had been ingrained in her since childhood. There was no room for mediocrity, no space for failure. She had made a promise to herself a long time ago: she would never allow anyone to dictate her worth. And she had lived by that promise every single day. Now, at 32, Simone was everything she had set out to be. A corporate attorney at one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, she had carved out a space for herself in a world that had never been designed for her success. With sharp intellect and an unshakable will, she had become known for her tenacity in the courtroom, for the way she could dismantle an argument with nothing more than her words and an unwavering stare. She was respected, feared even, by those who underestimated her. But that didn't mean the battles had stopped. Being a black woman in spaces not meant for her came with a weight that never lifted. It was in the subtle glances during board meetings, the condescending smiles from senior partners, the way her clients were often surprised when they realized she was the one in charge of their case. It was the unspoken but ever-present expectation that she should be grateful to even be there. But Simone wasn't grateful. She was deserving. Today was supposed to be a rare moment of indulgence, a pause from the relentless grind of her profession. She had just closed a high-profile case, one that had earned her firm a multi-million-dollar settlement. She had proven, once again, that she was a force to be reckoned with. So she allowed herself this small reward, an afternoon of shopping at one of the city's most exclusive boutiques, a place where luxury dripped from every carefully arranged display. The store was pristine, its white marble floors gleaming under the recessed lighting. Designer handbags, each worth a small fortune, sat in glass cases, tempting those who could afford them, or those who wanted to pretend they could. The scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the quiet hum of soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Simone moved through the store with ease, her posture straight, her confidence unshaken. She had worked hard for this life, for the ability to walk into a place like this and not feel like an outsider. But the world had a way of reminding her that no matter how successful she became, some people would always see her as less than. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The shift. The store manager, a middle-aged white woman with sharp features and a practiced smile, noticed her immediately. There was no warmth in her expression, no polite greeting. Instead, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, flicking down to take in Simone's tailored suit, her designer heels, the subtle but unmistakable signs of wealth. And yet, there was something else in her gaze: doubt. Simone felt the weight of it but ignored it. She had dealt with women like this before, women who assumed that her presence in a place like this was an anomaly, that she didn't belong. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But today, it was particularly exhausting. She reached for a handbag, running her fingers over the smooth leather, appreciating the craftsmanship. That was when she heard it, the whisper. "Watch her." It was quiet, barely above a breath, but she caught it. Her body tensed, her jaw tightening. Slowly, she turned her head, meeting the manager's gaze head-on. "Is there a problem?" Simone asked, her voice even, controlled. The manager's smile was tight. "Not at all. Can I help you find something?" Simone let the moment hang between them. She could walk away. She could ignore the insult laced within that simple statement, the assumption that she didn't belong. But why should she? "I'm just browsing," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that left no room for argument. Still, the air in the boutique had changed. The tension had settled in, thick and suffocating. She could feel the employees watching her, pretending not to, their eyes darting toward her whenever they thought she wasn't looking. The atmosphere was suffused with unspoken accusations, silent but deafening. And then, it happened. 2 police officers walked in, their presence immediate and commanding. Customers glanced up, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with curiosity. Simone barely had time to register what was happening before one of them stepped toward her. "We received a call about a shoplifter," the officer said, his voice laced with bored authority, as if he had already made up his mind about her. Simone's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression unreadable. She had been in courtrooms, she had stared down men who had far more power than these officers. She would not give them the satisfaction of rattling her. "Who called you?" she asked, even though she already knew. The manager stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, her face the picture of false concern. "I saw her take something and put it in her bag," she said, feigning regret. "I didn't want to assume, but I thought it was best to call the authorities." Simone's hands clenched at her sides. The audacity. The sheer gall of this woman, to lie so easily, so convincingly, knowing exactly what she was doing. "I didn't take anything," Simone said, her voice controlled but sharp. The officer shrugged. "Let's check your bag, then. If you didn't steal anything, you've got nothing to worry about." The trap had been set. Simone wanted to refuse, to stand her ground, to demand they check the security footage instead. But she knew how this worked. Refusing would be seen as resistance, which would escalate into something far worse. She exhaled slowly and handed over her handbag. The officer rifled through it with deliberate slowness, prolonging her humiliation, dragging out the moment. When he found nothing, he exchanged a glance with his partner. "Turn around," he said. The words sent a rush of cold fury through her veins. "For what?" she asked, her voice low, dangerous. "Ma'am, I'm not gonna ask again." And just like that, the cuffs snapped around her wrists. A collective gasp rippled through the store. Someone muttered, "What the hell?" A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene as Simone was led toward the exit like a criminal. The manager stood still, watching with satisfaction. The officers didn't care that she wasn't guilty. They didn't care about the truth. All that mattered was that someone who looked like her had been accused. And that was enough. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Simone wasn't just anyone. And in a few minutes, their world was about to come crashing down around them. The ride to the precinct was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was thick, suffocating, laced with unspoken tension. Simone sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists still bound, her fingers curling and uncurling as she fought to maintain her composure. The officers in the front seat spoke in low voices, muttering things they thought she couldn't hear. She caught pieces of it, something about entitlement, something about how they always act like victims. Her jaw clenched, but she refused to give them the reaction they wanted. The city blurred past the window, the world outside oblivious to the humiliation she was being forced to endure. She had always known that no amount of success, no level of achievement, would shield her from moments like this. But knowing didn't make it easier. It didn't stop the burning in her chest, the suffocating weight pressing down on her ribs. At the precinct, she was pulled out of the car with the same roughness as before. The fluorescent lights inside the station buzzed faintly, casting everything in a sterile, unforgiving glow. People were watching. Officers, suspects, clerks behind their desks, some indifferent, some curious, some entertained. One officer smirked as she was led past, nudging his colleague. "You'd think they'd learn by now," he muttered, shaking his head. Simone's lips parted, but she swallowed back the words threatening to spill out. Not yet. They walked her toward the booking desk, where a heavy-set officer with thinning hair barely looked up as he scribbled something onto a form. He glanced at her, then at the two officers who had brought her in. Shoplifting? He asked, bored. Yep, one of them said, tightening his grip on her arm as if she might suddenly lunge for the door. Caught her in the act. She have anything on her? Nah, but the store manager saw her stash something. You know how they are. Slick. Simone let out a slow breath through her nose, fury curling around her ribs like barbed wire. The officer at the desk finally looked at her then, his gaze scanning over her, assessing, judging. He frowned slightly, as if something didn't quite add up, but he didn't question it. Why would he? The accusation alone was enough. The assumption of guilt was all that mattered. All right, he sighed, reaching for a clipboard. Let's get her processed. The word processed sent a chill down Simone's spine. She had read about this. She had seen it happen to others. The slow degradation of dignity, the stripping away of humanity, the transformation from person to suspect to criminal in the eyes of the system. And she was supposed to just accept it? No. She straightened her back, her pulse steadying. They had no idea what they had just done. One of the officers nudged her toward a bench. Sit tight. Simone didn't sit. She stared at them, unwavering. Then, finally, she spoke. You might want to call your captain, she said, her voice calm, measured. And do it now. The officer nearest to her scoffed. And why the hell would we do that? Because you just made the worst mistake of your careers. Something in her tone made him hesitate, just for a second. But arrogance was a powerful thing. He snorted and shook his head. Sit down, lady. You're not in a courtroom now. Simone tilted her head, holding his gaze. You should really call your captain. The officer muttered something under his breath and turned away, but before he could take another step, a voice cut through the room like a blade. Who the hell arrested her? The room shifted. Officers who had been lounging at their desks suddenly straightened. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface ignited instantly, snapping through the air like electricity. And then, he walked in. Tall. Imposing. An undeniable presence that made the entire station feel smaller. Special Agent Malcolm Carter. Simone's older brother. The officers stiffened, eyes darting between him and each other, realization dawning too late. Malcolm was not just any federal agent. He was one of the highest-ranking members of the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, the very division responsible for investigating corruption, misconduct, and civil rights violations within law enforcement agencies. And he did not look pleased. His eyes locked onto Simone, taking in the cuffs around her wrists, the tension in her shoulders. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze onto the officers who had brought her in. Who arrested her? Silence. The booking officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. These two, sir, he said, nodding toward the cops who had grabbed Simone from the boutique. Malcolm turned to them. What's the charge? The first officer hesitated, the confidence he had worn so easily before now cracking under Malcolm's unyielding gaze. Shoplifting, sir. The store manager, did you check security footage? Well, no, but, did you find stolen merchandise on her? No, but the store manager, so let me get this straight, Malcolm said, stepping closer, his voice dangerously calm. You arrested a black woman, an attorney, by the way, based solely on an accusation, without evidence, without probable cause, and without bothering to verify anything first. The second officer, the one who had sneered at Simone in the store, shifted uncomfortably. We had reasonable suspicion, he muttered. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Let me tell you what you had, he said, voice low, measured. You had a racially motivated assumption. You had a false report from a store manager who clearly doesn't like seeing black people in her boutique. And now, you have a serious problem. The first officer bristled, his ego kicking in. With all due respect, sir, we were just doing our jobs. No, Malcolm said, stepping even closer, his presence now crushing. If you were doing your jobs, you wouldn't be in this mess. If you were doing your jobs, my sister wouldn't be standing here in cuffs over a crime that never happened. If you were doing your jobs, I wouldn't be here. But you know what? I am. He pulled out his phone. And that's when the shift truly happened. Because the officers who had been so sure of themselves minutes ago, they suddenly looked terrified. Malcolm's reputation preceded him. They knew exactly what kind of cases he handled. They knew what kind of power he wielded. One phone call. That's all it would take. Simone watched as their arrogance melted into panic, as they realized, too late, that they had picked the wrong woman to humiliate. Malcolm's thumb hovered over his phone screen, his expression unreadable. You want to know what happens next? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. The officers swallowed hard. And then, he made the call. The silence in the precinct was thick, a tension so dense it pressed down on every officer in the room. The weight of impending consequence loomed over them, suffocating in a way that not even the most arrogant among them could ignore. Malcolm stood tall, his phone still in his hand, his expression unreadable. His eyes, however, burned with calculated fury, and the two officers who had arrested Simone were finally beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. The smirks were gone. The self-assured confidence had drained from their faces. Now, there was only doubt. Uncertainty. Fear. Malcolm's voice was measured, even, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. You two really don't know what's about to happen, do you? His eyes flicked toward the sergeant standing behind the booking desk, the man who had casually dismissed Simone's arrest as routine. And neither do you. The sergeant shifted in his seat, his face suddenly pale, but he didn't speak. Simone stood still, watching. Every fiber of her being was telling her to savor this moment, to relish in the way the two officers who had mocked her, humiliated her, manhandled her like she was less than human were now standing in front of her with sweat beading on their brows. But she wasn't here for that. She wanted justice, not just revenge. Malcolm turned back to the officers. Let me spell this out for you, since you seem to be struggling to grasp the situation. My sister was unlawfully arrested. No probable cause. No evidence. And despite being given multiple opportunities to verify the false accusation, you chose to proceed anyway. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You see, most of the time when cops pull this kind of bullshit, the victims don't have someone like me in their corner. He lifted his phone slightly, his voice calm but razor sharp. But this time, they do. The first officer, the smug one, the one who had twisted Simone's wrists just a little too hard, cleared his throat, grasping for something to say, but nothing came out. Malcolm tilted his head. You still think you have control over this situation, don't you? He let out a small, humorless chuckle. That's cute. And then, he made the call. The moment his thumb pressed down, the station shifted. Every officer nearby subtly straightened, as if instinctively knowing that whatever was about to happen next was bigger than them. The phone barely rang before the voice on the other end answered. Director, it's Carter, Malcolm said, his voice devoid of any formality, straight to the point. We have a situation. The officers froze. There was only one director Malcolm Carter would call, the director of the FBI. The line was silent for half a second, then the voice responded, sharp and immediate. What's the issue? Malcolm's eyes never left the officers as he spoke. We have a civil rights violation. 2 officers arrested my sister under false pretenses. No evidence, no crime. This was a racial profiling incident, and I want internal affairs to handle it personally. He let the weight of his words sink in. Tonight. A beat of silence. Then the voice responded, firm. Understood. I'll make the call. And just like that, the phone call ended. The two officers looked as if their entire world had just collapsed beneath them. Simone watched as realization dawned on their faces. They knew what this meant. They knew what internal affairs coming down on them tonight would do to their careers, their reputations, their lives. Malcolm finally put his phone away and crossed his arms. Now, he said, voice still impossibly calm, let's talk about what happens next. The sergeant at the desk gulped, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. Agent Carter, maybe we should. No, Malcolm's voice was lethal, cutting the man off immediately. We're done with excuses. You're going to release my sister, and then you're going to hand over every single piece of documentation related to this arrest. Because if you don't... He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that it sent a shiver down the sergeant's spine. This entire precinct is going to have a very public, very ugly lawsuit coming its way by morning. The sergeant didn't argue. He didn't even hesitate. He grabbed the keys, walked around the desk, and without another word, unlocked the cuffs around Simone's wrists. Her skin was sore from the pressure, but she didn't flinch. She simply rolled her wrists, exhaling slowly, feeling the phantom burn of where they had held her too tight. She refused to rub at the marks. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The second officer, the one who had been so eager to put her in cuffs, looked like he wanted to disappear. Malcolm turned to him, his stare unreadable. You should both go ahead and clear out your lockers, he said, casual. Something tells me you won't be wearing those badges much longer. The officer flinched but didn't respond. Malcolm nodded toward Simone. Let's go. Simone took a slow, steady breath and stepped forward, walking past the officers, past the other cops who suddenly couldn't look her in the eye, past the onlookers who had watched it all unfold with hushed whispers. She didn't stop walking until she was outside, where the air was cooler, cleaner, freer. Malcolm followed, his expression still unreadable, but pride flickered beneath the surface. He knew his sister didn't need him to fight her battles. She was more than capable of doing that herself. But some battles weren't about just one person. Some battles were bigger than that. Simone exhaled slowly, glancing at him. They're going to regret this for the rest of their lives, aren't they? Malcolm smirked slightly. Oh, they already do. And as they walked away from the precinct, leaving behind the wreckage of arrogance and injustice, Simone knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just walking away from something. She was walking towards something far bigger. The night air outside the precinct was crisp, but the tension from inside still clung to Simone's skin, heavy like a second layer she couldn't shed just yet. The streetlights above them flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the pavement as she walked alongside Malcolm. The adrenaline that had kept her spine straight, her expression unreadable, was still there, simmering beneath the surface. Her wrists throbbed, but she refused to show it. The marks from the cuffs were proof, not of her guilt, but of their failure. Malcolm's stride was even, measured, but she knew her brother well enough to read the storm behind his eyes. He had been furious back in that station, but Malcolm never raised his voice unless it was necessary. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence, the way his words stripped people down to their barest truths, did all the damage needed. And now, with the precinct behind them, his silence was its own kind of rage. Simone finally broke it. They were shaking, she said, her voice even, but there was something raw beneath it. The moment you made that call, they knew they were done. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. They should be done, he muttered. But you and I both know how this works. The system bends for men like them. If we don't keep pushing, nothing happens. He turned to look at her, his eyes dark, calculating. But that's not going to happen this time. Simone let out a slow breath. No. It's not. She turned, her gaze falling on the city around them. It was strange, surreal almost, how the world just kept moving like nothing had happened. People walked past, laughing into their phones, stepping in and out of bars, heading home from late shifts. Blissfully unaware. No one knew that just an hour ago, she had been handcuffed like a criminal, paraded through a precinct like her existence was something to be ashamed of. And yet, even now, even knowing the consequences those officers would face, the rage inside her hadn't settled. It still burned, deep in her chest, because for every time justice was served, there were countless other times when it wasn't. She turned back to Malcolm. What happens now? Malcolm checked his phone, his expression unreadable as he skimmed a message. Then, he tucked it back into his pocket, his eyes locking onto hers. Internal Affairs is already on it. By the time those two wake up tomorrow, they'll be under full investigation. And not just for your arrest. Simone's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Malcolm's gaze flickered, something darker settling behind it. These weren't good cops having a bad day, Simone. They have a history. A long one. Simone's stomach tightened. How long? She asked, already knowing she wasn't going to like the answer. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. Long enough that we're about to open a much bigger case than just this incident. He let that sink in before continuing. Fabricated reports. Excessive force complaints. Suspicious arrests, always targeting the same kind of people. And before you ask, yeah, it's mostly black men and women. He let out a humorless chuckle. You were just the wrong woman at the wrong time. Or, depending on how you look at it, the right woman at the right time. Simone's pulse hammered. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. This was bigger than the humiliation she had suffered, bigger than the bruises on her wrists. These officers had been doing this for years, unchecked, protected by a system that thrived on silence and complicity. She clenched her fists. Then we don't stop until every single one of them is exposed. Malcolm's mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but something close. I was hoping you'd say that. The distant hum of the city buzzed around them, but Simone barely heard it. Her mind was already turning, racing through everything she needed to do next. She wasn't going to let this moment pass. She was going to make damn sure that when this was over, those men wouldn't just lose their badges, they'd lose the protection that had kept them untouchable for so long. But there was still something gnawing at her. A question she couldn't shake. She turned to Malcolm again. The store manager. She set this whole thing in motion. What happens to her? Malcolm's expression darkened. That's the part I'm handling personally. There was something in his voice, something lethal, final. Simone arched a brow. What are you planning? Malcolm exhaled slowly, his stance shifting. She filed a false police report. That's a crime. He gave her a knowing look. And she did it with malicious intent. Which means when this is over, she won't just be dealing with a fine and a slap on the wrist. Simone's stomach twisted, but not with doubt. With vindication. Good. She wanted that woman to feel it, the weight of what she had done, the gravity of the lie she had told so easily, so effortlessly, knowing exactly what it could have cost Simone. She wanted her to understand that this time, there were consequences. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. He glanced down, read something, then let out a small, satisfied breath. It's already starting, he murmured, tucking the phone back into his pocket. Simone's pulse spiked. What do you mean? Malcolm met her eyes, and this time, there was no hesitation. No doubt. Just certainty. Those officers, he said, voice low, steady. They're already suspended. Effective immediately. The precinct's already being forced to review their cases from the past 5 years. And the store manager? His smirk was cold, sharp. She's getting served a lawsuit and a criminal investigation. By morning, she won't just be out of a job, she'll be facing charges. Simone's chest tightened, the weight of everything that had happened settling in all at once. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about reckoning. And as she stood there, the marks from the cuffs still faintly imprinted on her skin, she finally felt it, the first flicker of something she hadn't been sure she'd get back. Power. Real, undeniable, unshakable power. And this time, she wasn't letting it go. The weight of the night hung heavy, the city still moving, breathing, alive with people who had no idea that, inside the walls of a precinct, an entire power structure had just cracked. Simone could feel the shift, it wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. It was about every name that had been erased, every story that had gone untold, every person who hadn't had someone like Malcolm to call. The consequences were already in motion, like dominoes falling, each one setting off a new chain reaction. The officers who had grabbed her, humiliated her, paraded her through the station like she was less than human, they were already off duty, their badges snatched away, their careers hanging by a thread. The store manager, the woman who had stood there with that smug, knowing look, the one who had knowingly told a lie that could have ruined Simone's life. She was next. But there was something deeper gnawing at her, something Malcolm had said back at the precinct. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a pattern. A system. And that meant this wasn't over. Malcolm walked beside her, his phone in his pocket now, but she could tell he was still calculating, still moving pieces in his mind. That was how he worked. He wasn't just after accountability, he was after change. And Simone knew that when Malcolm set his sights on something, he didn't stop until it was done. She turned to him, her voice steady. How deep does this go? Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes were sharp. Deeper than we thought. Simone already knew what that meant. It's not just those two, is it? Malcolm let out a breath, shaking his head. No. It's the whole damn precinct. A cold chill ran down her spine. It should have been shocking, but it wasn't. Malcolm continued, his voice low but charged with something electric. There's been a pattern of fabricated arrests, excessive force, intimidation tactics. And guess what? They've been burying complaints for years. IA is already digging into it, and I'm willing to bet those two officers were just the tip of the iceberg. Simone exhaled slowly. So what happens now? Malcolm's lips pressed together, his eyes flickering with something cold, calculated. Now. He let the question hang for a second before continuing. Now, we burn the whole thing down. The weight of his words settled between them, heavy, undeniable. Simone let them sink in, considering what this truly meant. This wasn't just about two racist cops losing their jobs. This wasn't about one boutique's blatant discrimination. This was about a system that had functioned unchecked for far too long. A system that was about to be exposed. And with exposure came retaliation. Simone knew this wouldn't end neatly. It never did. People in power didn't like losing their grip, and when they felt it slipping, they clawed back harder. She turned to Malcolm, her voice quieter now, but just as sharp. You know this isn't going to be clean. They're going to fight this. Malcolm nodded. I'm counting on it. Simone studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, looking up at the sky. The stars were barely visible beyond the city lights, but they were there, steady and unmoving. She closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself, before turning back to her brother. Then let's make sure they lose. A small smirk played on Malcolm's lips, just for a second. I thought you'd say that. The next morning, the headlines exploded. FBI launches investigation into police misconduct at city precinct officers suspended following wrongful arrest of black attorney boutique under fire for racial profiling incident. Everywhere Simone turned, her face was on the news. Footage from the store, from inside the precinct, was circulating online, people dissecting every second of her humiliation, her arrest, Malcolm's arrival, the moment everything turned. At first, it was overwhelming. The sheer volume of people talking about her, about what had happened, about what it meant. Then, the stories started rolling in. Other people. Other victims. Simone sat in her office, scrolling through email after email, message after message. People who had suffered under the same officers, people who had filed complaints and never seen justice, people who were terrified but finally willing to speak up because they saw what had happened to her, and how she had fought back. She looked at Malcolm across the desk. He was reading the same things, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. "They're coming forward," Simone said, voice quieter than she intended. Malcolm nodded. "Good." She let out a breath. "What do we do with all of this?" Malcolm set his phone down, meeting her gaze. "We make sure they're heard. Every single one of them." The dilemma was clear now. This wasn't just about taking down 2 cops. It wasn't even just about the precinct. It was about how far they were willing to take this. How much they were willing to risk to make sure this didn't just fade away like all the other cases that came before it. Simone leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples for a moment before exhaling. "If we do this," she said finally, "if we really go all the way, they're going to come for us." Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Let them." Simone studied her brother for a long moment. Malcolm had always been fearless. Unshakable. But this fight? This was different. And Simone? She wasn't fearless. She had spent her entire life calculating risk, knowing when to fight and when to walk away. But this? This was worth it. She looked back at the screen, at the flood of voices now speaking up, demanding justice, demanding change. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's burn it all down." The pressure was mounting. The weight of it sat heavy on Simone's chest as she watched the world react to what had happened. It was bigger now, so much bigger than just her arrest, her humiliation, her fight for justice. This was no longer just about her name being cleared. This was about every voice that had been silenced before hers, every person who had walked into that precinct in cuffs and never walked out the same way again. The messages kept pouring in, the stories unfolding in real time. Simone scrolled through her phone, scanning the hundreds of emails, the social media posts, the news reports dissecting every second of that night. People who had been arrested under false pretenses, people who had been beaten and threatened into silence, people who had tried to file complaints only for their cases to disappear into thin air. This precinct had been running a racket, a system built on fear, on power, on a certainty that no one would ever come looking. Except now, they had made a mistake. Now, someone was looking. She rubbed her temple, the dull ache in her head refusing to fade. This wasn't just overwhelming, it was infuriating. How many people had suffered in silence? How many had begged for someone to listen and had been ignored? The more she read, the angrier she got. Malcolm was on the phone across the room, his voice clipped, sharp. She only caught pieces of what he was saying, but she knew him well enough to hear the fight in his tone. He was working angles, pulling strings, making sure this wasn't something that could be buried or swept away. When he finally hung up, his expression was unreadable. Simone put her phone down, exhaling slowly. "Tell me." Malcolm's jaw tensed slightly, and that alone told her what she needed to know. "They're scrambling," he said, his voice low. "The captain is trying to spin this as miscommunication. They think if they throw those 2 officers under the bus, it'll be enough to make this all go away." Simone felt something hot and sharp crawl up her spine. "So they're sacrificing the small players to protect the system?" Malcolm nodded. "Classic move. They want the public to think it was just a couple of bad apples." He scoffed, shaking his head. "But we both know this is bigger than that." Simone clenched her jaw. "They can't just sweep this under the rug. Malcolm's eyes flickered with something cold. That's exactly what they're going to try to do. Simone leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Her mind was spinning, her pulse hammering. She had spent her entire career fighting battles in the courtroom, knowing that the law was rarely fair, that justice was often a privilege, not a guarantee. But this? This was different. This wasn't a lawsuit. This was a war. She exhaled sharply. What do we do? Malcolm was silent for a moment, considering his next words carefully. Then, he looked at her, his voice steady. We take it public. Simone frowned slightly. It already is public. Not like this, Malcolm said, shaking his head. Right now, we're playing their game. We're waiting for the system to fix itself, for the investigations to run their course, for the people in charge to do the right thing. But they won't. Not unless we make them. He sat down across from her, his expression hard. They're counting on this dying down. They're betting that in a few days, another headline will come along, another controversy will steal the spotlight, and people will forget. Simone swallowed. So what do we do? Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. We make it impossible for them to ignore. A heavy silence settled between them. Simone leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the desk. You're talking about full exposure. Malcolm nodded. Not just a press release. Not just statements. We bring the victims forward. We put faces to the stories. We don't just let the media tell our side, we control the narrative ourselves. We drag every single skeleton out of that precinct's closet and lay it bare for the world to see. Simone exhaled slowly. She knew he was right. The system didn't respond to morality or ethics, it responded to pressure. To fear. If they wanted real change, they had to force its hand. Her mind was already racing, planning. If we do this, we have to be airtight. No room for doubt. No room for them to claim this is just bad PR. Malcolm smirked slightly. Already ahead of you. Simone arched a brow. Of course you are. He leaned back, arms crossed. I've got lawyers, civil rights groups, journalists. The right kind. Not the ones who'll regurgitate the department's statement. The kind who dig, who expose, who make sure the whole country is watching. Simone felt the familiar fire in her chest ignite again. For the first time since this nightmare started, she felt like she was the one holding the power. She nodded. All right. Let's make sure they feel this. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. He checked the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly before a slow smirk spread across his face. Simone tilted her head. What? Malcolm met her gaze, his smirk widening. The store manager just quit. Simone blinked. What? Malcolm turned the phone toward her, showing a news article. The store had released a statement, distancing itself from the situation, calling it a tragic misunderstanding. And buried in the third paragraph, the manager had resigned effective immediately. Simone let out a humorless laugh. She ran before she could be pushed. Malcolm nodded. Looks like she didn't want to stick around for the lawsuit. Simone leaned back in her chair, exhaling. Good. Malcolm's smirk didn't fade. She thought she could throw you to the wolves. Now she's the one who lost everything. Simone studied his face, then shook her head slightly. That's not enough. Malcolm's smirk vanished. No, he agreed. It's not. Simone turned back to her phone, scrolling through the messages, the headlines, the stories of others who had been wronged. No. This wasn't over. Not until every single person responsible paid the price. Not until the system that let this happen was dismantled piece by piece. Not until they knew, truly knew, that they had messed with the wrong woman. The office was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the scattered glow of city lights reflecting off the polished surfaces. Stacks of case files, printed reports, and legal briefs covered every inch of Simone's desk, a chaotic arrangement that mirrored the storm raging inside her mind. Her pulse was steady, but there was a weight pressing down on her chest, a palpable tension that hadn't eased since the moment she walked out of that precinct. The gravity of what they were doing, the sheer magnitude of the fight they had stepped into, was becoming clearer by the second. This wasn't about a single injustice anymore. This was about pulling back the curtain on an entire system designed to protect itself at all costs. Malcolm stood near the window, his silhouette sharp against the darkened skyline. He was on his phone, the quiet murmur of his voice filled with a calm authority that carried the weight of experience. Simone didn't need to hear the specifics of his conversation to know exactly what he was doing. He was setting things in motion, pulling the right strings, making sure that no matter how hard the department fought to contain this, they wouldn't be able to bury it. Simone let out a slow breath, rubbing her temples as her eyes drifted over the flood of messages on her phone. The weight of so many voices filled the screen, emails from people who had suffered under the same police force, social media posts from victims who had been silenced for too long, families reaching out with stories that should have never been ignored in the first place. It was all there, laid out in black and white, a history of abuse that had existed long before she ever stepped into that boutique. The room was quiet, save for the occasional buzz of incoming notifications and the distant hum of traffic below. She turned toward Malcolm as he ended his call, slipping his phone into his pocket with a measured slowness that told her whatever he had just learned wasn't good. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "They're going to come after us, aren't they?" Malcolm didn't respond right away. He studied her for a moment, the weight of his thoughts reflecting in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a quiet fury, a controlled rage. "They already are," he said, his tone even, but sharp enough to cut through the silence like a blade. "They're working overtime to control the damage. Spinning the story, leaking just enough to make you look like the aggressor, like you're the one making a spectacle out of this." He let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And me? Apparently, I'm abusing my position. Using my federal connections to settle personal grievances." Simone's jaw clenched as she let his words sink in. "They're trying to turn this into a personal vendetta instead of what it really is," she muttered, exhaling through her nose. "They want to make me look like an angry black woman, who took this too far, and you like some rogue agent out for revenge." Malcolm nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That's exactly what they're doing. Because if they can make us the story, they don't have to answer for the real problem." Simone leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the armrest, her mind racing through the implications. "How much worse is this going to get?" she asked finally, already bracing herself for the answer. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying her, considering his next words. Then, he let out a slow breath. "That depends," he said, his voice lower now, carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. She narrowed her eyes. "On what? On how far you're willing to take this?" The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken truths. This wasn't just about fighting back anymore. This was about winning. About making sure that this wasn't just another case of temporary outrage followed by a slow return to the status quo. Simone met his gaze, her own resolve solidifying. "You already know the answer to that." Malcolm's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something almost protective. He hesitated for just a second, but that was enough. Simone leaned forward, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "What aren't you telling me?" Malcolm sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard before finally speaking. "They're digging," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Looking for anything they can use against you. They're desperate." Simone's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep her expression unreadable. "Of course they are," she muttered. "They can't win on facts, so they're trying to discredit me." Malcolm's jaw twitched slightly, and that alone told her everything she needed to know. He had already anticipated this. He had already prepared for it. She studied him carefully. And he met her gaze without hesitation. They've got nothing. She let out a slow breath, tension uncoiling from her spine, but only slightly. You're sure? Malcolm's expression darkened. I made sure. A cold sensation curled in her stomach. You looked into me. Malcolm didn't flinch. I had to. Simone swallowed hard, exhaling sharply. And you found nothing? Nothing they can twist, Malcolm confirmed. But it won't stop them from trying. They don't need the truth. They just need something they can spin. Simone let his words settle. She had always known this was a possibility. She had seen too many people destroyed by the mere suggestion of wrongdoing, by the power of a narrative manipulated in the right hands. She straightened her shoulders. They're scared. Malcolm smirked, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. They are. Silence stretched between them again, thick and charged. The gravity of what they were about to do, what they had already done, was undeniable now. There was no turning back, no stopping until this was finished. Simone tapped her fingers against the desk, her mind still turning. What about the officers? Are they fighting this? Malcolm nodded. One of them lawyered up, the other one is staying quiet. But it won't matter. IA already has them cornered. And the precinct? Malcolm exhaled through his nose. They're getting hit with a federal oversight order. A slow, sharp breath escaped her lips. Good. But she knew this wasn't the end. She turned her gaze back to Malcolm, her voice steady. We need to go bigger. This can't just be a scandal that fades away. It has to mean something. Malcolm studied her for a long moment before nodding. I know exactly how to make that happen. She arched a brow. Of course you do. His smirk was brief. Tomorrow morning. Be ready. Simone didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She trusted him. But deep down, she knew, whatever happened next, there was no going back. The weight of everything that had happened settled over the city like an approaching storm, thick with tension, anticipation, and an unshakable certainty that the system was about to crack open in a way it never had before. The news cycle had not died down. The people had not forgotten. The voices that had once been silenced were now speaking louder than ever, and there was no stopping what had already been set in motion. Simone stood before a row of cameras, the bright flashes reflecting off her skin, her presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with the power suit she wore and everything to do with the fire in her eyes. Her humiliation had been public, and now, so would be her victory. The press conference had been arranged carefully, strategically. This wasn't just about setting the record straight, this was about sealing the fate of those who thought they could get away with it. She did not mince words. She did not soften the truth, did not dilute it with the kind of carefully crafted statements that allowed people to wiggle their way out of accountability. She laid out the facts, the false arrest, the corrupt officers, the precinct-wide pattern of abuse and misconduct that was no longer just speculation but a fully documented, undeniable reality. She made it clear that this was not a one-time incident, that the officers who had arrested her were not rogue individuals but symptoms of a diseased system, one that had operated unchecked for far too long. And most importantly, she made it clear that this was not going to fade away like they had hoped. The legal action was in motion, not just against the officers, but against the department, the leadership that had covered for them, the bureaucracy that had enabled them. This was bigger now, unstoppable, irreversible. And as she stood there, facing the cameras, facing the world, there was no doubt, she had won. The fallout came swiftly. The two officers were not just fired but arrested, facing criminal charges that carried serious consequences. The captain of the precinct was forced to resign, his legacy forever tainted by the scandal that had shattered the department. Internal Affairs expanded their investigation, uncovering a deep-rooted network of falsified reports, wrongful convictions, and racial bias embedded in the very foundation of the department. The boutique, desperate to salvage its reputation, released statement after statement in an attempt to separate itself from the disaster, but it was too late. The manager who had called the police in the first place. Gone, her name blacklisted in the industry, her career a casualty of her own decision to weaponize a lie. But none of that compared to what came next. The precinct itself was shut down, its leadership dismantled, its practices exposed and condemned on a national level. And in its place, a federal oversight committee took over, ensuring that the cycle could not continue. The officers who had gotten away with it for years were now under investigation, and some were already facing indictments for their roles in past cases that had been unearthed in the wake of Simone's arrest. And as for Simone, she was more powerful than ever. What they had tried to use against her, her voice, her defiance, her refusal to be broken, had become the very thing that made her unstoppable. She didn't just return to her career. She elevated it. Her firm, recognizing the power of what had happened, gave her full control over a new initiative, one dedicated to fighting cases just like hers, to representing those who had been crushed under the weight of the same system that had tried to silence her. She became a symbol, not just of resistance but of the consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. Malcolm, ever the strategist, ever the architect of battles fought in the shadows, had never looked prouder. He had seen her fight for herself, but more importantly, he had seen her turn her pain into something greater, something that would not be forgotten. And as she walked out of that press conference, past the reporters, past the cameras, past the remnants of a scandal that had once been meant to break her, she knew with absolute certainty, she had changed the game forever. And they would never make the same mistake again. Now, take a moment. Think about what just happened. How many times has this story played out differently in reality? How many times has there been no Malcolm to make a call, no cameras to capture the injustice, no legal team willing to fight back? Simone's story had a victory, but so many others don't. And that is why this matters. That is why awareness, action, and accountability matter. If this story made you feel something, if it made you angry, if it made you think, don't let it stop here. Talk about it. Share it. Make sure that the next Simone out there isn't alone when it happens to her. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge, stories that reveal, stories that make you question the world around you, then hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist. Because these stories, they need to be told. And together, we make sure they are.